The following story is also available as a read-only version. Check the link in the description if you're interested. The punch card felt strange in Ernestino's hand. The anachronistic slip of cardboard was unyielding, its perforations enigmatic, surrounded by the same air of surreality as the small woman who had given it to him in exchange for a packet of salted almonds. He drew his coat closer against the cold winds blowing through the streets of Rome and took a final turn in a complex of concrete abominations. It was a dead end with a heavy metal door, more rust than steel at this point. For a moment, Ernestino felt like an idiot. He was just some history student looking for volume 38 of Polybius's Histories, a book which, according to most sources, no longer existed. The only reason he was here was because he'd taken the advice of someone he'd never met before. Chances were he was about to get robbed. But there was something about the punch card and the woman herself that he could not quite shake as being genuine. Who asked for salted almonds as a payment for anything? Who used punch cards to get into places? It took him a moment to find the tiny slit near the lock. After taking a deep breath and almost breaking into a chuckling fit, he inserted the punch card. It was pulled from his fingers with voracious force. Some internal mechanism made the door click and clack. Then, with a groan, it pushed itself open, and the dusty smell of old books blew out of the darkness beyond. Ernestino hesitated. This was his last chance to turn back, the final opportunity to shake his head, give up on finding the book that didn't exist, and make do without it. But how could he do that? His eyes needed a moment to adjust to the light of the gas lamps. The more he saw, the more he realized he had come to the right place. Shelves upon shelves of books, and not two of them identical in size, shape, or contents. Some were squat and sturdy, stacked atop one another. One was tall and thin, almost concerningly so, poking up from the labyrinth 10 meters or more, almost scraping the brick dome that was the ceiling. Though they were fitted with ladders, Ernestino was convinced that climbing up there would lead to a catastrophic collapse. He took a few hesitant steps. The shelves were overflowing with books, tomes, even scrolls, ranging from pristine to ruined, slotted in with seemingly no rhyme or reason. How was he ever going to find anything in here? The door fell shut behind him. Ernestino's heart skipped a beat. He scrambled back to it on instinct more than rational thought. Out of nowhere, a man appeared, a stack of books in hand, jerking back, almost falling. He let out a curse in what sounded like German. "Watch it!" Franz shouted. The kid had dashed from the shelves out of nowhere. "Did nobody ever tell you not to run in a library?" All he got was a perplexed look. Of course. The door. He repeated his question in the heavily accented and unlikely to be grammatically accurate Italian he was capable of. "What is this place?" the kid responded. Heavens, a newcomer. Franz did not have time for this. "It's a library, you idiot," he grumbled, pushing past the kid and heading off in an unmistakable gesture that he had places to be and did not want to be bothered. It seemed as though the message had been too cryptic for the newcomer, as he followed Franz like a puppy dog, offloading a slew of questions that came too fast for him to even understand them all. He didn't need to. Every newcomer had the same questions, including Franz himself once upon a time. He'd been among the quicker ones to learn that it was pointless to look for answers. The library offered all kinds of knowledge, but on the matter of its own nature it remained silent. "There's an information desk at the center. All the books are indexed there. If your book is not in this room, it will tell you where you can find it," Franz explained. The kid looked at the labyrinth of bookshelves ahead, daunted. "How do I get there?" "Just try, you'll manage." Franz demonstratively picked up his pace. If he'd told the truth, that the maze was in a constant process of reorganizing itself, that would prompt even more questions he had no time to answer. Just follow your instincts and you'll make it, he added when the kid was still following. Having finally shaken the newcomer, Franz walked through a tall archway and out of the room, finding himself in a corridor with spiral staircases going up and down on either side as far as the eye could see. He took the seventh to the left downward and found himself in his very own small but cozy reading room. Aside from the naked bulb hanging from the low ceiling, lighting was provided by battery-powered LEDs. The black walls were almost entirely hidden behind stacks upon stacks of books. Franz put down his latest haul on the table, grabbed the top book, The Star of Solomon by Arthur C. Clarke, and reclined in the armchair that he had just found down here some years ago. The science fiction narrative was immediately captivating, and Franz was well over 100 pages into it when he could have sworn that someone had just sprinted up the spiral staircase from his tiny room. That had been a close call. Sang-mi had almost been caught by the German. She was surprised that he hadn't even so much as spotted her when she'd been cowering underneath his table. Usually he was out for much longer. She had not expected him to return so quickly. But she'd made it, with the book she'd been looking for in hand. She should have known that Odoric of Pordenone's journal about his travels in the library would be among the tomes the German kept down there. Now all she needed was the key. Without making a sound, Sang-mi hushed past the spiral staircases and to the revolving door at the end of the corridor. She made one turn, and it opened to a great hall of white marble, smelling of incense. Another turn, and it opened to a vast cavern where bats with glowing eyes hung from the ceiling. On the next turn, it opened to a lonely mountaintop, devoid even of snow, with nothing but clouds to the horizon. The final turn brought her where she wanted to go, a hallway done in an 18th century European style, the beige paint on the walls chipping off and falling onto the numerous stacks of books on the parquet floor. Behind the tall, narrow windows to the right, colourful fish swam through an expansive coral reef. She took the third corridor branching off, walking through a dark tunnel of magazines until she reached a rounded archway opening to a Song Dynasty Palace tea room, with a balcony overlooking the forests. Some of the usual people sat in the usual places. One group in particular, 3 old men wearing era-appropriate garments, were being served tea by maids with wooden faces, never saying a word. They had been sitting there every time she entered this room of the library in the 3 years she had known about it. Sang-mi couldn't even begin to guess how long they had been sitting there before that. If she wanted to get the key, she needed to find the librarian. Sang-mi sat down on the balcony and waited to be served. The colours on the face of the waitress who brought her tea had faded, making what had once been a smile look like the grin of a serial killer. Grimacing with anticipation, Sang-mi downed the disgustingly bitter brew in only a few swallows. It was better to get these things over with as quickly as possible. Charleston, the man who had taught her this trick, always carried a bottle of stevia drops with him in case he needed to locate the librarian in this tea house. Like all men, Charleston used clever tricks to disguise his weakness. Sang-mi did not believe in such luxuries. Gently, she began shaking the cup with a little tea left in it, watching the patterns that the black leaves swirling around in there were forming. After a few seconds, she became frustrated and shook a little harder than intended. Taking a deep breath, she started again, and a picture slowly coalesced. The librarian was nearby, but if her interpretation was correct, it would be difficult to sneak up on him. With a sigh, she put down the porcelain cup and made her way back into the corridor with the underwater windows. She took the next branch, entering a vast maze of red rock, the morning sun burning hot in the desert above. Shelves were carved into the walls, the books inside of them untouched by the weather. It was easy to get lost in here if one could not read the subtle markings etched into the stone. Even now she was taking wrong turns. The wind piped through the smooth tunnels and crevices, playing the landscape like a massive organ. Short of breath and having begun to sweat in the heat, Sang-mi arrived at a small hole in the ground. Even for her, it was barely large enough to slide into, and the small steps in the darkness required the precision of a ballerina. Moments later, she stepped out of an open crate in the rumbling hold of a cargo zeppelin. It looked like a thing straight out of a World War I adventure book, down to the vast ocean passing by through the windows outside. All the boxes, labeled in Greek or maybe Russian, were full of books. Sang-mi moved without making a sound, her light steps masked by the rumble of the propeller engines. The librarian was easy to spot. He was a decrepit old man, more wrinkles than face, white hair splayed in all directions. He was sitting on a stool, slim shoulders bent forward, hunching over an arcane tarot ritual. Dangling from his crumbling leather belt, flashing silver, was the key. The librarian chose to ignore the thief as she made off with his key. Instead, he finished his solitaire tableau, packed up the cards, and rose. His bones cracked like he'd been sitting for a century. He had to stretch out his arms to get rid of the pain. Ponderously, he walked into the cockpit to check the gauges and controls. He turned a lever or two to make sure the boat was driving steady, then walked back into the hold, where a chess set had appeared where his cards had been only moments before. Sometime in the past or future, he had made another move just now and was waiting for himself to respond. The librarian took a moment to analyze the board, then made a move of his own. Considering how poorly his opponent was playing in this particular game, he had to be in the past. The librarian opened the outer hatch of the airship and stepped into a cold, shadowy library inside an ancient tower. A central ladder ran through it from top to bottom, with wooden platforms mounted at regular intervals to allow people access to the books, which were located on stone shelves worked into the walls. Few readers came here anymore. They all preferred the larger rooms, the ones with a lot of books packed tightly together, where they could find what they were looking for easily, without having to go through strange and dangerous rooms. Maybe the librarian was getting old again, but he lamented this loss of a sense of adventure in the modern times. After climbing up a few levels, he walked through a metal door and into the microgravity of a space station. The white tube was bright and sterile, and an astringent smell hung in the air. Terminals chimed as he floated past them, asking for input on questions of chemistry and physics. Others offered him helpful directions through the library. If it had been up to him, the librarian would have never installed those terminals. They were convenient, yes, but they also strengthened the complacency the modern people had with giving their minds over to machines. But the library had a will of its own, and he had to come to terms with that. Looking through one of the portholes, he saw Earth, covered in a sheet of mother of pearl, and shook his head. What sublime hubris had created such a thing? He sighed. There was no doubt about him getting old again. He arrived at the end of the tube, planted his feet carefully on the ground, then stepped out of the altar of a cathedral dedicated to no deity in particular. All the pews were bookshelves, laden mostly with religious texts or treatises on philosophy or theology. As he shuffled over the cool stone tiles, the librarian reminisced of simpler times. This was a good room. It provided ample space for material, quiet corners for reading, and it tied into a central theme. The librarian found an open travel chessboard lying on a cluttered table. His opponent had made another move. Checkmate! He sat down and laughed. Maybe he wasn't in the past after all. Excuse me, a tall man with an Australian accent says. Mr. Librarian, I have something for you. The librarian looked at what he was holding outstretched in his hand and smiled. It was a book he'd never seen before. On the inside, Charleston was giggling like a little girl. It wasn't every day one could surprise the librarian. The old man paged through the slim black volume, looking over the alien letters. After a few moments, he started to laugh. "Oh, what a scamp," he said, wiping a tear from his eye. "What is it?" Charleston asked. "It's a tactics manual for Go, published many years from now. Someone is joking with me." Charleston smiled. He had found it on the steps of a museum in Hobart and figured it must belong here. There was a quiet understanding among those who frequented the library that books which did not belong in the world should be returned.
Mr. Charleston, I have something you might be interested in.
The librarian led him to a nearby shelf and produced a small paperback.
This is a cookbook written by Socrates, translated into English by Sir Ian Francis Burton.
I'm not that much of a cook, unfortunately, Charleston responded.
Well, then you ought to become one, no?
The librarian gave him a toothless smile. His pager beeped. That had been quick. Charleston excused himself and took off, moving through a cave of books into a rainy New York street with neither cars nor people in it. By way of an Italian butcher shop, he took an elevator down into a clock tower. There was a clock face on each of the 4 walls, every one of them transparent, and every one looking into a different world. Through the northern one he could see a vast sandy desert, whereas behind the eastern one there was a port with ships made of mushroom. To the south, Charleston could see an overgrown industrial landscape, and to the west was a rugged expanse of ice and frost. Mr. Lee sat at one of the many reading tables, looking at Charleston with scorn. "What happened?" Charleston asked. "You said you were going to distract him." The Chinese man's Oxford accent was flawless. Though he was young, he spoke with martial authority. "That's what I was doing when you paged me." Charleston raised his arms defensively. "Well, Sang Mi ran into trouble. This is what happens when you get a Korean to do a job that requires brains." Mr. Lee slapped his hand flat on the table. "I heard that." Sang Mi was coming up a stairwell, pushing a weeping young man in front of her, with a very effective arm lock. "Who is this?" Mr. Lee demanded. "My problem. He was sniffing around the vault, practically ran into me." "Please, I was only going where the reception desk sent me," the boy said in broken English. "What is your name, young man?" Charleston asked. "Who gives a shit what his name is?" Mr. Lee spat. "Ernestino Padani, sir," the kid responded. "Please, I am just a student. I did not do what she says I did." "I don't care." Mr. Lee rose. He had a pistol in his hand. "Hold on there, mate." Charleston stepped in his way. "He's barely more than a child. You cannot disrespect the sanctity of the library." "You think I care about the rules that this abomination of a place has? There are secrets in here, national secrets of the United States, Japan, Australia, India, everyone. My government does not care how I get them, so long as I get them."
"And how do you think the great empires of the past fared in their attempts to outcompete their enemies with the knowledge contained within these halls?"
The librarian was suddenly standing in front of the northern clock face. He had desert sand in his hair.
"How would you distinguish between documents which are real and documents which do not apply to your reality?"
Mr. Lee spun around with trained precision and pointed his gun at the librarian. "Stay back, ungodly creature."
"This place does not like being a slave to national interests, Mr. Fung,"
said the librarian. "How do you know my name?" A moment of terror flashed over Lee's face.
"I know many things about you, Xia Wen Feng, born on the 16th of August 1992 in Baoding, Hebei Province. I know that your father was a school administrator and your mother an army clerk before she became a housewife."
The librarian took a single step. Mr. Lee pulled the trigger without a moment's hesitation. The bullet hit the librarian perfectly in his heart. The old man looked down at the bloodless hole in his chest, then at Lee, disappointment on his face. Then he crumbled to dust. The room was silent. Even the clocks seemed to stop ticking for a moment. "What in all blazes did you just do, mate?" Charleston demanded. Mr. Lee was about to respond when he caught fire. He dropped the gun, screaming in unspeakable agony as his body was bathed in flames. Charleston stepped back from the heat, worried he might catch fire himself. The blaze was over as quickly as it had begun. Mr. Lee was standing there, unharmed. Not even his clothes were singed. But something about him was different. Something in his gaze. Whoever he had been moments earlier, nothing of that person was left. "I'd like my key back now, if you don't mind," he said to Sang Mi. Even his voice was different somehow. The thief hesitated, but ultimately obliged. She handed the librarian the key she had stolen from him. "Now I banish you." Sang Mi did not even have time to protest. She simply plopped out of existence as though she had never been there. Charleston swallowed heavily. He was terrified of what would happen next. "Mr. Charleston, you've always had respect for this place. The fact that you can find new books means that you are special, and in light of the fact that you were coerced to do what you did, I will not banish you. You are, however, being watched." He mimicked their gazes meeting with his fingers. Charleston almost wanted to go to his knees. Being banished from the library would be a fate worse than death. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." "Don't be sentimental now," the librarian smiled. "This young scholar seeks volume 38 of Polybius's Histories. You know where it is located. Redeem yourself by showing him to it."
If you liked this story and would like to hear more, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel. A new short story is uploaded every Wednesday, and there will occasionally be another one in between if I find the time. Thank you very much for listening and have a great day.